So it's nice to see I got a promotion to president. Um, I do want to point out, though, I actually just accepted a position recently at University of California, Los Angeles, as the Morgan and Helen Chu Professor of Education and Asian American Studies. And I'm continuing some work with NYU as a fellow and a professor on leave. So I want to thank Freeman. I think that was a great way to kind of set the stage for what I want to talk about today. The problem is clear. The goals have been established in a lot of ways. What I want to talk about is the role of inquiry and research in developing and assessing strategies for overcoming some of these challenges. There's a few things I want to focus on in particular. One is the broader equity agenda in higher education, and especially the relevance of new and emerging populations. I'm going to mainly focus on the Asian American and Pacific Islander population, which is a population that I spent a lot of time studying. I want to take a deeper dive into issues around STEM and how we think about and work with the AAPI student population, and the extent to which they're often overlooked and underserved when it comes to our commitment to increasing minority participation. And then finally, I want to talk about a project I have where we're working with minority-serving institutions that are serving AAPI students, and some of the research and assessment we've been doing and the role that the inquiry plays in informing some of their efforts and the broader kind of relevance of MSIs in U.S. higher education. At the heart of my work is really the changing demography of the nation and why that should be central to how we approach our work as practitioners and policymakers and scholars. So we're all familiar with some of these demographic changes, and a lot of this was not just revealed, but kind of solidified our knowledge around what's happening to the U.S. population. The size of the white population has been pretty stagnant, and it's projected to continue to be quite stagnant. It is older in its composition, and it's a shrinking proportional representation in the U.S. population. Nearly all of the growth over the past decade, and then also in the future, is going to be attributed to people of color, more specifically immigrants and children of immigrants. And these populations are also younger, and they represent the future composition of the U.S. So these demographic trends are really at the heart of why the AAPI population is so critical for how we think about education policy in the 21st century. So in a 20-year period between 1990 and 2010, the AAPI population in the aggregate doubled in size. But what this chart demonstrates is that rate of growth, this rate of growth was actually more representative of East Asians, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans than is the case for other AAPI subgroups. So Southeast Asians, which include Vietnamese, Hmong, Cambodian, and Laotians, tripled in size in this 20-year period. And South Asians, which include Asian Indians, Bangladeshis, and Pakistanis, quadrupled in size. So we're seeing differential growth rates in the AAPI population, and it's really altering the face of the AAPI population. One population or sector of the Asian American population is refugees. Refugees from Asia have been kind of the largest refugee population in the US since the Vietnam War. And so while during and following the Vietnam War, we had a large sector of Southeast Asians that came over to the US, about 1 million in a 10-year period. Now the new emerging groups are they're Southeast Asians / South Asians from Burma, Nepal, and Bhutan. So just in the past 5-7 years, we've had about 250,000 that have come over from Burma and Nepal and Bhutan. So, we're seeing this incredible heterogeneity in the AAPI population. And um, uh, I think the takeaway is really that we have to think about who these students are. How the AAPI population is quite diverse, and what it means for how we approach our work with this large and growing population. Um, the AAPI population represents 48 different ethnic groups, a range of immigration histories, 300 different languages in the US, and wide variation in income and social status. So what it means on the ground in our institutions, in our communities, is that we have to look more closely at who the students are we're serving, right? And um, when it comes to AAPI population, a lot of people use kind of a general image in their minds about what is the typical AAPI student experience. Um, and what we're encouraging folks to do is to think about AAPIs in local context. So if you take Westminster, California, this is the largest concentration of Vietnamese outside of Southeast Asia. A large proportion of the population has high school or less as their highest level of education. 2/3 of the adults speak English less than very well. In Brooklyn, we often don't think of Brooklyn as a place for Asian Americans, but you have a sizable concentration of Chinese in Sunset Park and Bensonhurst area. 3/4 of Chinese are foreign born. There's a large proportion of children who do not speak English very well. Fairly high poverty in their neighborhood. St. Paul, Minnesota. This is also the largest concentration of Hmong outside of Southeast Asia. 2/3 of the adults have not completed high school, high unemployment, high levels of poverty. And Hmong have a large proportion of our households that are overcrowded with 6 or more persons per household. Waianae, Hawaii. This is the largest concentration of Native Hawaiians in the nation. And nearly 4 out of 5 adults have not finished high school. And 1/3 of the family with children are living below poverty. So this is a rate of poverty for families with children that's four times the national average. So, I hope this data helps to give you a glimpse into what's happening if you kind of drill down deeper into subgroups among AAPIs. We also have to think about how we measure success, attainment for populations. When we think about the AAPI population, we have these images in our minds about Harvard and Ivy League, other Ivy League institutions, University of California, AAPI students attending selective universities. But actually what we're finding is that the largest sector of AAPI college participation is in community colleges. And this is a trend that's actually been increasing. So if you look at the bottom and work your way up, you see that the proportional representation in community colleges is actually increasing and not decreasing. We're really interested in understanding this more and targeting attention to AAPI students in the 2-year sector. And I'll share with you some of what we're learning so far. Compared to AAPIs in 4-year institutions, AAPI community college students are facing a number of risk factors. So they're more likely to enter college with lower levels of academic preparation. They're enrolling in remedial education at a higher rate. They're more likely to be older. They're attending college as part-time students. They're delaying matriculation, and they tend to work, more likely to be working full-time. They're also more likely to come from low-income backgrounds, be the first in their families to attend college. They have an immigrant origin background. And so what we're seeing is that, we have to understand these different communities in different contexts. And it's a really important point to make because we look at national reports oftentimes and we try to apply that information to our work locally and on the ground and within our institutions. And that's very problematic when it comes to the AAPI population. You know, we think about AAPIs as representing like the success story, right? They're the face of academic achievement. And actually what we're seeing in terms of degree attainment rates is a lot of uneven outcomes. You know, AAPI students are coming to college with a range of academic preparation. They're attending different kinds of institutions, and we're seeing significant differences in their educational attainment. So nearly half of Southeast Asians and Pacific Islanders are leaving college without earning a degree. This is 3 to 5 times the likelihood of dropping out than is the case for East Asians and South Asians. So East Asians and South Asians not only have a higher likelihood of completing college, earning a degree, but they're also more likely to go on to get an advanced degree. So I want to go further down the pipeline and look at STEM outcomes in particular and show how these things play out in terms of career trajectories. Because again, the perception is we have high representation of AAPIs in STEM fields. What happens is when you look at the AAPI population in the aggregate, it's concealing significant differences in STEM outcomes for AAPI subgroups. So these are this is occupational representation of AAPI subgroups in STEM and health fields as well compared to production and transportation. So what you see is there's large sectors of the AAPI population that's relegated to low-skilled, low-wage jobs. And a lot of this is likely a function of their educational background and attainment. So, you know, we've been spending a lot of time identifying some of these issues for the most marginalized and vulnerable subgroups of AAPIs. And then now we're looking more closely at programs and the things that institutions are doing to support the most marginalized and vulnerable AAPI subgroups. There's a program called the AANAPISI program. Anybody know what that is? I don't know, Frankie knows what this is. He worked at AANAPISI. So AANAPISis are basically minority-served institutions for AAPIs. So it's very similar to the HSI program. Very similar legislation, very similar definition. So we've been looking at AANAPISI programs, and we're trying to understand the extent to which they're able to better serve, better understand, and improve the outcomes of their AAPI students. So we have funding from the Kresge Foundation, Lumina Foundation, USA Funds, and the Walmart Foundation. I think more importantly, this is an MSI funders group, which is really interesting because these foundations are coming together and they're targeting the resources and you know, basically coming up with a common agenda around minority-served institutions. So what we're doing is we're engaging higher ed policymakers and practitioners to expand knowledge about low-income AAPI students, as well as the institutions that serve them. And we're working directly with AANAPISis to help them leverage their status and resources to improve educational participation and outcomes for low-income AAPI students. And then I think most importantly, we're leveraging research and assessment to help institutions be more effective. So we're looking at how they use their funding, and we're analyzing the effectiveness of these programs and where they could scale up and institutionalize some of the efforts that are supported by their grant. So I just want to share with you some of what we're doing around this project. So quickly, the research questions: in what ways does AANAPISI funding and the designation improve the ability of campuses to respond to the unique needs of AAPI students? Second, to what extent do AANAPISI programs and activities result in higher persistence, degree attainment, and transfer rates? So I will highlight one of our campus partners. So City College of San Francisco. This is one of the largest community colleges in the nation. API students make up nearly 40% of the student body. And what City College did with their AANAPISI funding was to create curricular pathways to college level courses. They want to improve degree attainment and transfer rates. And they have a particular interest in STEM, especially for API subgroups with lower levels of persistence and degree attainment. And you know what the importance of AANAPISI funding was for City College was overcoming this perception that APIs are overrepresented in STEM and do not face challenges and do not have any particular needs. And what they were actually observing, so what they started with was a self-assessment process. What they're actually finding was low passing rates in certain courses like math, biology, and chemistry. And then they're finding particularly low rates for Filipinos, Southeast Asians, and Pacific Islanders. So these are some of their largest sectors of their student body. So they used their AANAPISI funding to create the API STEM Achievement Program. This is a cohort program, and they created a center for counselors and tutors and supplemental instruction. They're improving curricular pathways and expanding access to STEM sections. And then they're doing embedded student services, including academic and counseling services. So we studied longitudinal data for API students in the AANAPISI funded program and tracked their academic performance, credit accumulation, and we looked at their persistence and degree attainment rates. And we compared these students to a representative comparison group of students in similar courses, and we created this retroactively fitted sample using a stratified sampling design. So it's a quasi-experimental design. And so I want to share with you some of what we found. And by the way, we're replicating this research across a number of AANAPISs. So we found that the ASAP students attempted more credits, earned more credits than students in the comparison group. And then we also found that ASAP students had a higher GPA in the term of interventions than students in the comparison group. And then we also found that ASAP students had a higher persistence rate than is the case for students in the comparison group. So ASAP students were also more likely to, when they finished, they were more likely to earn a degree, an associate's degree, or transfer than was the case for students who were not in the program. So a lot of students ended up with a certificate, and even when they transferred, they were going to different kinds of institutions. So the non-ASAP students were seeing a lot more attrition out of the STEM fields. So I just want to conclude by saying it's important to think about the heterogeneity of the population, changing demography of the nation, and what it means for local communities and the institutions that are serving them. So this particular population, the Asian American and Pacific Islander population, is too often overlooked and underserved. We have these generalizations on a national level, and it's missing incidences where we're seeing low educational attainment and low representation in STEM for a large sector of some of these API subgroups. We talked a little bit this morning about a cultural change, and I think that's a very important factor in what the AANAPISI program is able to do for institutions. So the resources are able to shed light and bring attention to the needs of particular groups, and but it's more than that. So the thing I appreciate about what Freeman talked about is it's not just a president or a single person in an institution that needs to encourage change and to kind of provide that North Star, but it takes the whole campus to a broad array of folks on campus to be engaged in these efforts. The importance of inquiry, I think, cannot be understated. We have to not just develop these programs, but we have to assess their impact, whether or not they're making a difference. It's also important to think about assessment and inquiry on the front end to identify who these students are, what are their needs, and how can we best match up the program with what those needs are. For AAPI students, they're often left out of the assessment. We do this thing where we group Asians and whites together, and we create these kind of, this dichotomy around, who needs resources, who doesn't. As the population changes, we got to think about, even among racial groups, even among Blacks, Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans, there's a great deal of heterogeneity in these populations. And so it doesn't mean race is not relevant. It means that it means we have to think about subgroups at an even more granular level. Part of what happens with Asian Americans is we're grouping domestic and international students. This really skews the data, especially for Asians, because Asians typically make up the largest sector of our international student population. So we're also working with institutions to help them around the quality of the data that they have and the ability of data systems to be able to collect and report on good data on AAPI students. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussions to come. I want to thank Kitty and Norm for inviting me. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions for Robert, if any are continuing discussion before we have our break and go into our breakout groups. There must be a comment.
Actually,
Hi,
I wanted to make one. This was really interesting to me because it was something that I really had no knowledge of, those kinds of discrepancies across the Asian student population. One of the things that we've done is when I look at the Hispanic Latino student population, it's the same type of thing. Yep. And I was always concerned when we implemented programs for these students of treating them all the same. Is your recommendation that we not treat them the same? That we put, or that, because what we ended up doing was we actually put in programs at my institution for Hispanic Latino students. We didn't differentiate from those that were born in the U.S. or not born in the U.S., those that were foreign, et cetera. What is your recommendation in terms of implementing programs for this student group?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think my recommendation is don't assume you know who your students are, what they need, and how you could best serve them. One of the most fascinating things I've experienced working with AANAPISis, I went to De Anza College, and the president showed me two pictures of two classrooms. One of the classrooms almost exclusively white. The other classroom was very diverse, right? And I said, what are these? Brian Murphy's this incredible leader over at De Anza College. He says, this picture, the one with all the white students, is a picture of De Anza College about 30 years ago. This other picture is a picture of our classroom today. And, he says, even now, you can't assume that who the students were even 10 years ago are the students that are there today. And so he says he has to always think about who his students are, who the emerging populations are. The point I made about the new refugee groups, we've had 250,000 refugees from Burma, Nepal, and Bhutan. They weren't even counted in the census 10 years ago. And, we got to figure out, well, where are they going? Are they being concentrated in particular communities? Are they being concentrated in certain institutions? So the assessment has to also occur in even understanding who our students are. And for Latino population, it's going to vary. It's going to depend on the specific community geographically.
Excellent talk. I really learned a lot from this talk. Yes, I'm Theresa Maldonado from the National Science Foundation Engineering Directorate. I'm sitting here listening to your talk, learning a great deal, and I'm thinking engineering faculty in particular have become more and more international. Mm-hmm. When they get hired, they go through a faculty orientation to go over health benefits and things like that. Mm-hmm. And have you looked at a segment in faculty orientation about who they may be teaching in the classroom and also who their peers may be in what countries, but also just faculty development throughout their career at the university that they may be at? So do you have some elements of your programs along the lines of faculty development?
Yeah, so I wrote a book in 2010, and the last chapter I talk about the academic trajectory of AAPI scholars. And so not only is there perception that AAPIs are well represented in undergrad populations and graduate school, but also in the faculty ranks. And the interesting thing I found is that AAPIs are more likely than any other group to be non-tenure track faculty. And so they're often research professors, they're non-tenured ranked professors. So associate professors, full professors without tenure. And I think what's happening is they're often on a visa, and they're kind of, there's not a full commitment to having them stay on the faculty. But that's something we got to learn a lot more about. And what happens in that kind of scenario where you do have some Asian American faculty who are in STEM and other fields, but a large concentration of the API faculty are actually international, non-U.S. citizens.
I'm Emily Allen from San Jose State University, soon to be from Cal State Los Angeles. We're an AANAPISI institution and have an AANAPISI grant. And so we are well aware of the huge diversity in the Asian American population. One of the things we've been doing with our faculty advisors is bringing in speakers to talk about things like this. And I think the critical thing is that in the end, every single student is different. And even that class of 30 white students at De Anza were quite different, quite diverse. Many of them probably very low income from the orchards of Silicon Valley that don't exist anymore.
Yep.
And so I'm interested if you are aware of or keep track of, similar to Theresa's question, of programs for teaching faculty about who their students really are and how to not make these kind of assumptions in the classroom or in the research setting.
Yeah, one thing we're doing with the AANAPISI research is not just looking at the programs that are supported by the grant, but the ability of the institution to sustain efforts once the grant goes away. So some campuses like South Seattle Community College, they've been doing a lot of professional development with their grant. They're taking retreats, they're doing these kind of ongoing professional discussions around students and programs. And we're working with some campuses to also to do analysis of syllabi. It's one thing for a faculty member to say, oh yeah, I've learned something about my students, but can they institute that knowledge and broader awareness into their curriculum? And we want to see it reflected in the syllabi. So yeah, I think that's extremely important. It's something that I wish I could delve more deeply into, but it's nice to see that some campuses are able to leverage the little grant they have to kind of sustain an effort like that.
Will you join me in thanking Robert, please?